The spring of 1943 arrived in Washington, D.C. without fanfare. Cherry blossoms bloomed along the tidal basin as they always did, indifferent to the war that consumed the world beyond America's shores. Inside a converted townhouse on Q Street, now serving as a liaison office for Free French forces, Captain Henri Moreau sat at a desk that wasn't his, in a country that wasn't his home, serving a government that existed only in exile. The room smelled of old wood and cigarette smoke. A single window overlooked a narrow street where American officers walked with the confidence of men whose cities still stood. Henri watched them sometimes, envying that certainty. His own uniform, pressed and proper, felt like a costume. The Cross of Lorraine on his sleeve marked him as one of de Gaulle's men, but what did that mean here, thousands of miles from occupied France? He was 34 years old. His wife and daughter were somewhere in Lyon, or had been when his last letter reached him 6 months ago. The Red Cross had stopped confirming addresses. He didn't know if they were alive. He didn't know if they remembered his face. Every morning he woke up and chose not to think about it. Every night he failed. The work kept him functional. Henri had been assigned to coordinate intelligence sharing between Free French operatives and the American Office of Strategic Services. It meant reading reports, attending meetings, translating documents. It meant being useful without being trusted. The Americans were polite, professional, distant. They needed France, but they didn't need him specifically. He was replaceable. Forgettable. That was fine. He preferred it that way. The assignment had begun in November 1942, 5 months ago. Henri had expected temporary duty, a few weeks, perhaps a month. But weeks became months, and the work never stopped. Reports arrived daily from North Africa, from London, from resistance cells operating in the shadows of occupied France. Each document carried fragments of a war he could only observe from across an ocean. He developed routines to survive the waiting. Morning coffee at the same cafe on Connecticut Avenue. Lunch at his desk, usually a sandwich he barely tasted. Evening walks along the Potomac when the weather allowed. He wrote letters to his wife every Sunday, knowing most would never arrive. He kept them short, factual. He didn't mention the doubt that had begun to hollow him out from the inside. The other French officers in Washington formed a tight community, meeting for dinners, sharing news from home, arguing about politics and strategy. Henri attended occasionally, out of obligation. He found their certainty exhausting. They spoke of liberation as if it were inevitable, as if their presence in America mattered in some grand design. He nodded and drank wine and said little. His American counterpart at the OSS was a major named Robert Caldwell, a former professor from Yale with wire-rimmed glasses and a methodical mind. Caldwell treated Henri with careful respect, the kind reserved for allies whose usefulness remained unproven. They met twice weekly to review intelligence summaries. The conversations were efficient, cordless. "Anything significant this week, Captain?" Caldwell would ask. "Nothing actionable," Henri would reply. It was true most of the time. The intelligence was valuable in aggregate, pieces of a puzzle being assembled by men far above their rank. But individually, each report felt like noise. Troop movements. Supply routes. Names of collaborators. Henri processed it all with the same mechanical precision, filing information into categories, forwarding summaries up the chain of command. He wondered sometimes if this was all he would contribute to the war. A clerk in a foreign city, shuffling papers while other men fought and died. In February, a new directive arrived from London. De Gaulle's headquarters wanted enhanced coordination on a specific intelligence network operating in Brittany, a coastal region critical to Allied invasion planning. The network, codenamed Marcel, had been providing detailed information on German fortifications, naval movements, and troop deployments. The intelligence was considered highly reliable. Henri was tasked with serving as the primary liaison for Marcel-related communications. It meant more meetings with Caldwell, more reports to analyze, more responsibility. It also meant something else. For the first time since arriving in Washington, his work felt connected to something real. The reports from Marcel were different. They carried texture, urgency. Whoever ran the network understood what mattered. Beach gradients. Concrete thickness. Guard rotation schedules. This wasn't abstract intelligence, this was preparation for invasion. Henri found himself reading each report multiple times, imagining the operatives who risked everything to gather these details. One report in particular stayed with him. It described a German officer in St. Malo who had been observed meeting regularly with local resistance contacts. The report suggested the officer might be sympathetic, possibly recruitable. It included physical descriptions, habits, routines. Henri recognized the care in those observations. Someone had watched this man for weeks, noting every detail, weighing every risk. He forwarded the report to Caldwell with a note, potential asset. Recommend further cultivation. Caldwell's response came back within hours, noted. Will monitor. That was all. No discussion, no follow-up. Henri learned not to expect more. The Americans made their own decisions, in their own time. His role was to provide information, not to influence outcomes. March arrived cold and gray. Henry's routine continued unchanged. Coffee, work, walks, letters. The cherry blossoms began to bloom, drawing crowds to the tidal basin. He avoided the area. The beauty felt obscene somehow, a reminder of normalcy in a world that had forgotten what normal meant. On March 18th, a Thursday, Henri received a summons to Caldwell's office. The message was brief, meeting 1,400 hours. Urgent. He arrived early, waiting in a hallway lined with maps of Europe. Caldwell appeared precisely at 2 o'clock, carrying a folder marked with red classification stamps. Captain Moreau, thank you for coming. Caldwell's tone was different, sharper, more focused. We need to discuss Marcel. They moved into a small conference room. Caldwell closed the door and laid the folder on the table between them. We've received new intelligence, Caldwell said. Marcel has been compromised. Henri felt something cold settle in his chest. Compromised how? The Gestapo arrested 3 members of the network last week. 2 in Rennes, 1 in St. Malo. They're being held for interrogation. Do we know what they've revealed? Not yet. But we have to assume the worst. Caldwell opened the folder, revealing photographs and typed reports. The network leader is still operational. Codename, Corbeau. We believe he's planning to evacuate remaining members and go dark. Henri studied the documents. Corbeau, the Crow. He'd seen the codename dozens of times but had never known the man behind it. The file contained a photograph, a thin man in his 40s, dark hair, intense eyes. A teacher, according to the biographical summary. A teacher who had built one of the most effective intelligence networks in occupied France. What do we do? Henri asked. Caldwell was quiet for a moment. When he spoke, his voice carried a weight Henri hadn't heard before. London wants Corbeau extracted. They're planning an operation, a submarine pickup off the Brittany coast. It's scheduled for April 2nd, 2 weeks from now. That's good, Henri said. He's too valuable to lose. There's a complication. Caldwell pulled out another document. Corbeau refuses to leave unless we extract his entire team. 17 people, Captain. 17. Henri looked at the number. 17 lives. 17 people who had risked everything, who had families, who had reasons to survive. The submarine can't take that many, Caldwell continued. Maximum capacity is 8, including Corbeau. We've made that clear. He won't budge. So we extract 8 and leave 9 behind? That's the operational reality. Henri stared at the photograph of Corbeau. The man's eyes seemed to look directly at him, asking a question he didn't want to answer. What does London say? London says Corbeau is the priority. If he won't leave without his team, we extract him by force if necessary. The intelligence he possesses is too critical to lose. By force, Henri repeated. The words tasted bitter. "We need you to draft the communication," Caldwell said. "You're the liaison. The order needs to come through Free French channels. London wants Corbeau to understand this isn't an American decision, it's coming from his own command structure." Henri understood immediately. They wanted him to write the order that would condemn 9 people to capture, interrogation, execution. They wanted his signature on their death warrant. "When do you need this?" he asked quietly. "Tomorrow morning. The submarine departs from Portsmouth in 10 days. Corbeau needs time to prepare." Caldwell closed the folder and stood. "I know this isn't easy, Captain. But we're at war. Sometimes we have to make impossible choices." Henri didn't respond. Caldwell left the room, taking the folder with him. Henri sat alone in the silence, staring at the empty table. That night, Henri didn't go home. He walked instead, moving through the darkened streets of Washington without destination or purpose. The city felt alien, too clean, too safe, too far from the war that consumed everything he'd ever known. He found himself at the Lincoln Memorial near midnight. The statue loomed above him, marble and shadow, a man who had also made impossible choices. Henri sat on the steps and tried to imagine what he would write. To Corbeau, extraction authorized for 8 personnel maximum. You are ordered to select priority evacuees and proceed to designated coordinates. The words formed easily. That was the problem. He could write the order. He could make it sound reasonable, necessary, inevitable. He could hide behind the language of military necessity and operational constraints. But he would know. He would always know. He thought about his daughter, Sophie. She had been 7 years old when he last saw her, small, bright, fearless. Did she still remember him? Would she understand, someday, what he had done in this war? Would she be proud, or would she ask the question he couldn't answer, why did you choose some lives over others? Henri returned to his apartment as dawn broke over the Potomac. He made coffee, sat at his small desk, and pulled out a sheet of official letterhead. The blank page waited. He began to write. But not the order Caldwell expected. The human moment. Henri worked through the morning, drafting and redrafting, choosing each word with surgical precision. By noon, he had 2 documents. The first was the official order Caldwell had requested. It was clear, professional, unambiguous. It condemned 9 people to death with bureaucratic efficiency. The second was a letter to Corbeau. A personal communication, unauthorized and dangerous. In it, Henri explained the situation honestly, the submarine's capacity, London's priorities, the impossible mathematics of survival. But he also included something else, detailed information about German patrol patterns along the Brittany coast, alternative extraction points, and the names of resistance contacts in neutral Spain who might help evacuate those left behind. He was giving Corbeau options. He was giving him a chance to save everyone, even if it meant defying orders, even if it meant risking the entire operation. Henri knew what he was doing. He was committing treason, or something close to it. He was prioritizing individual lives over strategic objectives. He was choosing conscience over duty. He sealed both documents in separate envelopes. At 1,400 hours, he delivered the official order to Caldwell's office. The major reviewed it briefly and nodded approval. "This will be transmitted tonight," Caldwell said. "Thank you, Captain." Henri returned to his own office. The second envelope sat in his desk drawer, waiting. He had no official channel to send it. Marcel's communication protocols ran through OSS oversight. Any message he sent would be logged, reviewed, potentially intercepted. He would have to find another way. That evening, Henri attended a gathering of French expatriates in Georgetown. He rarely went to these events, but tonight he had a purpose. He found the man he was looking for near the back of the room, a journalist named Philippe Rousseau who had fled Paris in 1940 and now wrote for underground publications distributed in occupied France. Henri approached carefully. "Philippe, I need a favor." Rousseau studied him with the wary eyes of a man who had learned not to trust easily. "What kind of favor?" I need to get a message to someone in Brittany. Outside official channels. That's dangerous. I know. Russo was quiet for a long moment. Then he nodded. Give me the letter. I can't promise it will arrive, but I have contacts who might be able to help. Henri handed him the envelope. No explanation, no justification. Russo took it and disappeared into the crowd. Henri left the gathering and walked home through streets that felt slightly less alien than before. He had made his choice. He had done what he could. Now he could only wait. The final certainty. 3 days later, Henri received confirmation that the official order had been transmitted to Marcel. Caldwell mentioned it in passing during one of their routine meetings. Corbeau acknowledged receipt, the major said. No response yet on his decision. Henri nodded, keeping his expression neutral. When will we know? The submarine departs in 7 days. If Corbeau doesn't confirm by then, the operation is scrubbed. 7 days. Henri counted them carefully, marking each one with the same mechanical precision he applied to everything else. He went to work, processed reports, attended meetings. He wrote his Sunday letter to his wife, filling it with empty reassurances. He didn't know if his unauthorized letter had reached Corbeau. He didn't know if it would make any difference. But he had tried. That would have to be enough. On March 28th, 4 days before the scheduled extraction, Caldwell summoned him again. We have a response from Corbeau, the major said. His tone was unreadable. Henri waited. He's accepted the terms. 8 personnel will be extracted, including himself. He's provided the names. Henri felt something loosen in his chest. Relief, perhaps. Or just exhaustion. That's good news. There's more. Caldwell pulled out a decoded message. Corbeau sent a secondary communication. He's arranged for the remaining 9 members to attempt an independent evacuation through Spain. He's asking for no official support. He doesn't want to compromise the primary operation. But he wanted us to know they're trying. Henri read the message carefully. Between the lines, he recognized his own information, the patrol patterns, the contact names, the alternative routes. Corbeau had used what Henri had given him. He was trying to save everyone. Will they make it? Henri asked quietly. I don't know, Caldwell said. The odds aren't good. But they have a chance. A chance. Not a certainty. Not a guarantee. Just a possibility that 9 people might survive because someone had given them information they weren't supposed to have. Caldwell was watching him carefully. Did you have anything to do with this, Captain? Henri met his gaze steadily. I wrote the order you requested, Major. Nothing more. It wasn't quite a lie. The order existed. It had been transmitted. What happened outside official channels was beyond his control. Caldwell studied him for another moment, then nodded slowly. The submarine operation proceeds as planned. April 2nd, 0200 hours. If Corbeau's people make it to Spain, that's their business. Understood. Henri left the office and walked back through the spring afternoon. The cherry blossoms were in full bloom now, covering the city in pink and white. He stopped at the tidal basin and stood among the crowds, watching petals fall into dark water. He had broken the rules. He had chosen individual lives over strategic necessity. He had risked his career, possibly his freedom, for 9 people he would never meet. He didn't regret it. For the first time in 5 months, Henri Moreau felt like something more than a clerk shuffling papers in a foreign city. He felt like a man who had made a choice that mattered. The war would continue. The waiting would continue. But something had changed. Not in the world, perhaps. But in him. He watched the cherry blossoms fall and thought about his daughter. Someday, if he survived this war, if he made it home, she might ask him what he had done. And he would be able to tell her, I tried to save lives. I didn't always succeed. But I tried. That would have to be enough. April arrived with unseasonable cold. Henri woke on the morning of April 2nd to frost on his window, a thin layer of ice that distorted the view of the street below. He dressed in the dark, moving through routines that had become automatic. Coffee. Uniform. The walk to the office through empty streets. The submarine operation was scheduled for 0200 hours, 2 in the morning, Brittany time. 7 hours ahead of Washington. By the time Henri reached his desk at 0800, the extraction would already be complete. Corbeau and 7 others would be aboard a British submarine heading for Portsmouth, or they would be dead. The 9 who stayed behind would be moving south, if they had followed the information Henri had provided. Through back roads and safe houses, avoiding checkpoints, hoping the Gestapo was looking in the wrong direction. Or they would already be captured, facing interrogation rooms and consequences Henri tried not to imagine. He sat at his desk and waited for news that might never come. The office felt different that morning. Quieter, perhaps, or maybe it was just his own perception. Caldwell was away, gone to some meeting Henri hadn't been invited to attend. The other staff moved through their routines with the same mechanical efficiency, processing reports, filing documents, maintaining the machinery of war from a safe distance. Henri opened the morning intelligence summary. Routine updates from North Africa. A decoded message from London about supply coordination. Nothing about Marcel. Nothing about Brittany. He forced himself to focus on other work. There were always reports to review, translations to complete, summaries to prepare. The war didn't pause for individual operations, no matter how much they weighed on his conscience. By noon, still no word. Henri ate lunch at his desk, a sandwich he barely tasted, coffee that had gone cold. He watched the clock on the wall mark time with indifferent precision. Each minute that passed without news could mean success or catastrophe. There was no way to know. At 1430 hours, Caldwell returned. Henri saw him through the office window, moving quickly down the hallway with a folder under his arm. The major's expression revealed nothing. 10 minutes later, the summons came. Henri walked to Caldwell's office with steady steps, keeping his breathing controlled, his face neutral. Caldwell was standing by the window when Henri entered. He turned, and for the first time since they'd begun working together, Henri saw something like emotion in the man's eyes. The submarine made contact, Caldwell said. 8 personnel extracted successfully. Corbeau is safe. Henri felt relief wash through him, followed immediately by the question he couldn't ask directly, what about the others? Caldwell seemed to read his thoughts. No word yet on the secondary group. It's too soon. If they're following the route if they're heading south, it could be weeks before we know anything. The route Caldwell had almost said it. Almost acknowledged what Henri had done. But he'd stopped himself, and Henri understood why. Some things were better left unspoken, existing in the space between official channels and personal conscience. Corbeau sent a message, Caldwell continued. He handed Henri a decoded transmission. He wanted you to see it. Henri read the brief text. 8 away safe. 9 moving south as planned. Thank the officer who gave U.S. options. Some debts cannot be repaid. Corbeau. Henri read it twice, then handed it back. His throat felt tight. He didn't trust himself to speak. I don't know what he's referring to, Caldwell said carefully. But I'm not going to ask. The operation was successful. That's what matters. Yes, sir. Corbeau will be debriefed in London. His intelligence will be invaluable for invasion planning. You did good work, Captain. Henri nodded. He left the office and returned to his desk, where he sat for a long time staring at nothing in particular. 8 people were safe. 9 were trying. He had given them a chance. Whether they survived would depend on luck, skill, and factors beyond anyone's control. It would have to be enough. The days that followed settled into a new kind of waiting. Henri continued his routines, work, walks, letters, but now there was an additional weight to carry. Somewhere in occupied France, 9 people were moving through enemy territory, depending on information he had provided. Their survival or capture would be, in part, his responsibility. He checked every intelligence summary for mentions of arrests in Brittany. He reviewed Gestapo activity reports with obsessive attention to detail. Any indication that the 9 had been caught would appear in these documents eventually. The Germans were meticulous about documenting their victories. April passed slowly. Cherry blossoms gave way to spring leaves. The weather warmed. Washington filled with tourists and bureaucrats, all moving through a city untouched by war. Henri walked among them feeling like a ghost, present but not quite real. Caldwell mentioned Corbeau occasionally in their meetings. The network leader was in London, providing detailed briefings on German coastal defenses. His intelligence was proving even more valuable than anticipated. Plans were being adjusted based on his information. Lives would be saved because of what he knew. But Corbeau asked about his team in every communication. The 9 who had stayed behind. No one had answers for him. In mid-April, Henri received a letter from Philippe Rousseau, the journalist who had helped him send the unauthorized message. They met at a quiet cafe near Dupont Circle. "I wanted you to know," Rousseau said quietly, "the message reached its destination." "I can't say more than that, but it arrived." "Thank you," Henri said. "I don't know what was in that letter," Rousseau continued, "and I don't want to know. But I hope it helped." "So do I." They finished their coffee in silence and parted ways. Henri walked back to his apartment through streets that felt slightly less foreign than they had a month ago. He had taken a risk. He had broken rules. He had chosen to act rather than simply obey. The consequences of that choice were still unfolding. May arrived with humidity and heat. The war in North Africa was reaching its conclusion, German and Italian forces collapsing under Allied pressure. Victory there seemed inevitable now, though the cost had been staggering. Henri processed reports of casualties with the same mechanical precision he applied to everything else, but the numbers haunted him. Each one represented someone's son, brother, father. Each one was a life that had mattered to someone. On May 12, a Wednesday, Henri received an unusual summons. Not from Caldwell, but from a colonel he'd never met, a senior OSS officer named Harrison who worked in strategic planning. The meeting was scheduled for 1,600 hours at an address Henri didn't recognize, a building near Georgetown University. He arrived early and was escorted to a small office on the 3rd floor. Colonel Harrison was a compact man in his 50s with gray hair and the weathered look of someone who had seen combat. He gestured for Henri to sit. "Captain Moreau, thank you for coming. I'll get straight to the point. We've received information through our contacts in Spain." Henri's pulse quickened, but he kept his expression neutral. "Yes, sir. 9 French nationals crossed the border near San Sebastian 3 days ago. They were exhausted, malnourished, but alive. All 9. They're currently in the custody of Spanish authorities, but arrangements are being made to transfer them to Gibraltar." Henri felt something break open inside his chest, relief so intense it was almost painful. "All 9? "All 9, Harrison confirmed. They had detailed information about safe routes, contact names, timing. Someone gave them exactly what they needed to survive." The colonel was watching him carefully. Henri met his gaze without flinching. "I don't know who provided that information," Harrison continued. "And I'm not going to investigate. But I want you to understand something, Captain. What happened with Marcel, the extraction, the secondary evacuation, it's being studied. There are people in this organization who believe we made a mistake. That we should have forced Corbeau onto that submarine and left his team behind. And what do you believe, sir?" Harrison was quiet for a moment. "I believe we're fighting this war to preserve something worth preserving. And if we lose our humanity in the process, we've already lost what matters most." He stood and extended his hand. 17 people are alive because someone made a difficult choice. That's worth something. Henri shook his hand. "Thank you, sir." "One more thing," Harrison said. Corbeau is being reassigned. He'll be working with Allied intelligence in London, helping plan the invasion. He asked specifically that you be informed about his team. He said you would want to know. He was right. Henri left the building and walked through Georgetown in the late afternoon light. 17 people alive. 8 extracted by submarine. 9 who had walked through occupied France and across the Pyrenees into Spain, following routes and contacts he had provided. All of them safe. He had broken the rules. He had risked everything. And it had worked. For the first time since arriving in Washington, Henri felt something close to peace. Summer arrived with oppressive heat. Washington became a city of humidity and thunderstorms, where even walking a few blocks left you drenched in sweat. Henri's routines adapted. Earlier morning walks. More time in the office where fans provided minimal relief. Evenings spent reading reports and trying not to think about his family in Lyon. The war continued its inexorable progression. Sicily was invaded in July. Italy would be next. The Allies were winning, slowly and at terrible cost, but winning nonetheless. Henri processed intelligence about German troop movements, supply problems, strategic withdrawals. The machinery of war ground forward. In August, Caldwell mentioned casually during one of their meetings that Corbeau had been promoted. He was now a major, working directly with SHAEF, Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force. His intelligence on coastal defenses was being incorporated into invasion planning at the highest levels. He still asks about you, Caldwell said. Wants to meet you someday, after the war. Perhaps, Henri said noncommittally. But the idea stayed with him. Corbeau, a teacher who had become a spy, who had built a network from nothing, who had refused to abandon his people even when ordered to do so. Henri wondered what they would say to each other if they ever met. Would they discuss the choices they'd made? The rules they'd broken? Or would they simply acknowledge what couldn't be spoken, that sometimes duty and conscience pointed in different directions, and you had to choose which voice to follow? On August 24th, Henri received news that changed everything. It came in the form of a telegram, delivered to his apartment by a Red Cross courier. He opened it with hands that had learned not to shake, preparing himself for the worst. Wife and daughter confirmed safe stop currently in Switzerland. Stop details to follow. Stop. Henri read it 3 times before the words penetrated. Marie and Sophie were alive. They had somehow made it out of occupied France, across the border into neutral Switzerland. They were safe. He sat down on his bed and let himself feel what he had been holding back for nearly 2 years. Relief. Joy. Grief for the time lost. Hope for a future that suddenly seemed possible again. The details arrived over the following days. Marie had been part of a resistance network in Lyon, something she had never mentioned in her letters, assuming they were being monitored. When the Gestapo began arresting network members in June, she had fled with Sophie, moving through safe houses until they reached Switzerland in late July. She had been trying to contact him ever since. There was an address in Geneva. A way to send letters that would actually arrive. The possibility of communication after months of silence. Henri wrote immediately. He told her about Washington, about his work, about the waiting. He told her he loved her, that he thought about her and Sophie every day, that he would find a way to bring them to America or return to them in Europe, whichever came first. He told her everything he had been unable to say for 2 years. He mailed the letter and allowed himself to imagine a future beyond the war. A life where he wasn't defined by the choices he'd made in dark offices, where he could be simply a husband and father again. But the war wasn't over. And there was still work to do. September brought cooler weather and a new assignment. Caldwell called Henri into his office on a Tuesday morning with an unusual request. "We're bringing Corbeau to Washington," the major said. "He's coming for a series of briefings with senior staff. He'll be here for 2 weeks, starting October 1st. Henri felt something tighten in his chest. "I see. He's specifically requested to meet with you. Says you were instrumental in the Marcel operation's success." Caldwell paused. I've approved the meeting. It will be informal, dinner, perhaps. A chance for him to thank you personally. That's not necessary. Maybe not. But he wants to do it anyway. Caldwell studied him. You saved his team, Captain. All 17 of them. He knows that. I know that. And I think you need to hear him say it. Henri didn't respond. What could he say? That he had only done what conscience demanded. That he had broken rules and risked everything for people he'd never met. That he still didn't know if he'd made the right choice. October 1st arrived with clear skies and autumn air. Henri went to work as usual, processed reports as usual, maintained his routines as usual. But there was an undercurrent of tension he couldn't quite suppress. Corbeau was in Washington. Somewhere in this city, the man whose life he had helped save was breathing the same air, walking the same streets. The meeting was scheduled for October 3rd, a Friday evening. Caldwell had arranged for them to meet at a small French restaurant in Georgetown, neutral ground, away from offices and official channels. Henri arrived early and sat at a corner table, watching the door. Corbeau entered at precisely 1900 hours. He was thinner than his photograph suggested, with gray streaking his dark hair and lines around his eyes that spoke of sleepless nights and impossible decisions. He wore a British uniform now, with the rank of major and ribbons Henri didn't recognize. Their eyes met across the room. Corbeau walked over slowly, and Henri stood. They shook hands without speaking. Corbeau's grip was firm, his palm calloused. The hands of a man who had done more than push papers. Captain Moreau, Corbeau said quietly. His English carried a heavy French accent. I have wanted to meet you for a very long time. Major, Henri replied. Please, sit. They sat. A waiter brought wine. For a long moment, neither spoke. The restaurant hummed with quiet conversation around them, but their table existed in its own silence. Finally, Corbeau spoke. I know what you did. The letter you sent, outside official channels. The information about routes and contacts. My people would not have survived without it. Henri looked down at his wine. I only gave you options. You made the choice. You gave me the ability to choose. That is not a small thing. Corbeau leaned forward. Do you know what it means, to be ordered to abandon your people? To be told that some lives matter more than others? Yes, Henri said quietly. I know. I could not do it. Even if it meant losing everything, I could not leave them behind. And then your letter arrived, and suddenly there was a possibility. Not a guarantee, but a chance. 9 people walked across France and over the Pyrenees, Henri said. That wasn't because of information I provided. That was because of their courage and your planning. It was both, Corbeau insisted. Courage without information is suicide. You gave us what we needed to survive. Henri met his eyes. And if they had been caught? If the Gestapo had intercepted them? That would have been my responsibility too. No, Corbeau said firmly. That would have been the war's responsibility. The Germans' responsibility. Not yours. He paused. You gave 17 people a chance to live. Some of us make it through this war, some of us don't. But we all deserve the chance to try. The waiter brought food. They ate slowly, talking about other things. Corbeau spoke about his work in London, the invasion planning, the intelligence that was being gathered. Henri talked about Washington, the waiting, the distance from everything that mattered. Toward the end of the meal, Corbeau pulled a small photograph from his pocket and placed it on the table. It showed a group of people standing in front of a stone building, 17 faces, some smiling, some serious, all alive. My team, Corbeau said. Taken in Gibraltar after the 9 arrived from Spain. I wanted you to see them. To know they are real people, not just names in a report. Henri studied the photograph. Young and old, men and women, all looking at the camera with expressions that carried the weight of what they had survived. These were the people he had helped save. These were the lives that had hung in the balance while he made his choice. "Thank you," Henri said quietly. "No," Corbeau replied. "Thank you." They finished their wine in comfortable silence. When they parted outside the restaurant, Corbeau shook Henri's hand again. "After the war," Corbeau said, "if we both survive, come find me in France. I will introduce you to every person in that photograph. They should know who you are." "Perhaps," Henri said. But he knew he would. Someday, when the war was over and the world had found some new equilibrium, he would go to France and meet the 17 people whose lives had intersected with his in a moment of impossible choice. He walked home through Georgetown's quiet streets, carrying the photograph Corbeau had given him. 17 faces. 17 lives. 17 reasons to believe that sometimes, breaking the rules was the only way to do what was right. October passed into November, and the war ground forward. Italy was invaded. The Soviets were pushing west. The Allies were winning, though victory still seemed distant and uncertain. Henri's work continued. Reports, meetings, translations. But something had shifted. He no longer felt like a clerk shuffling papers in a foreign city. He felt like someone who had made a difference, however small, in a war that consumed millions. Marie's letters arrived regularly now, full of details about life in Switzerland, about Sophie's schooling, about plans for the future. They were talking about Henri bringing them to America, at least until the war ended and it was safe to return to France. The paperwork was complex, but possible. In late November, Caldwell called Henri into his office with unexpected news. "You're being reassigned," the major said. "London wants you for liaison work with SHAF. You'll be working directly with invasion planning staff." Henri absorbed this. "When?" "January. After the holidays." Caldwell paused. "This is a promotion, Captain. Your work here has been noticed. The Marcel operation, specifically. There are people who believe you have the judgment and discretion needed for more sensitive assignments." "I see. You don't seem surprised." "I'm not," Henri said honestly. "I knew there would be consequences, one way or another." Caldwell smiled slightly. "Consequences. That's one way to put it." He extended his hand. "Congratulations, Captain. You've earned this." Henri shook his hand, feeling the weight of everything unsaid between them. Caldwell knew what he had done. Harrison knew. Probably others knew as well. But no one would speak of it directly. Some truths existed in the spaces between official records, acknowledged but never documented. That evening, Henri wrote 2 letters. The first was to Marie, telling her about the reassignment, about the possibility of being closer to her in Europe, about hope for the future. The second was to Corbeau, care of his London address. Henri wrote simply, "Thank you for the photograph. I will keep it safe. After the war, I will come to France. We will meet again. Until then, stay alive. H.M." He mailed both letters and walked along the Potomac in the cold November air. The water was dark and smooth, reflecting city lights like scattered stars. Somewhere across that ocean, a war was being fought. Somewhere in Switzerland, his wife and daughter were safe. Somewhere in London, 17 people were alive because he had made a choice. Henri thought about the man he had been when he arrived in Washington, hollow, waiting, convinced his contribution to the war would be nothing more than processed paperwork. He thought about the man he was now, someone who had risked everything for strangers, who had chosen conscience over orders, who had learned that sometimes the most important decisions happened in quiet offices far from battlefields. The war would continue. There would be more impossible choices, more moments when duty and humanity pointed in different directions. But Henri knew now which voice he would follow. He had learned to live with uncertainty. He had learned to act despite fear. He had learned that 17 lives mattered more than any regulation or protocol. That was enough. That was everything. London in January 1944 was a city holding its breath. Henri arrived on a grey morning when fog hung so thick over the Thames that the bridges seemed to float in nothingness. The air smelled of coal smoke and damp stone, and everywhere he looked, he saw the scars of war: bombed buildings, sandbag barriers, windows covered with tape against blast damage. This was a city that had survived the Blitz, that had endured 3 years of bombing, rationing, blackouts, and loss. The people moved through the streets with a kind of grim determination Henri recognized immediately. They were tired, but they hadn't broken. They were waiting, like everyone else, for the invasion that would finally turn the tide. Henri's new assignment placed him at Norfolk House, a requisition building near St. James's Square that served as SHAF headquarters. His role was liaison between Free French forces and Allied invasion planning staff, a position that sounded impressive but meant, in practice, attending endless meetings and translating documents that detailed the most ambitious military operation in history. Operation Overlord. The invasion of Normandy. The beginning of the end, if everything went according to plan. Henri shared an office with 2 other liaison officers, a Canadian major named Thompson and a Polish captain named Kowalski. Both men had been in London since 1940, both had seen more combat than Henri ever would, and both treated him with the polite distance reserved for newcomers who hadn't yet proven themselves. The work was overwhelming. Intelligence reports flooded in daily from across occupied France, resistance networks, aerial reconnaissance, captured documents, interrogation summaries. Every beach gradient, every German bunker, every coastal gun emplacement had to be catalogued, analyzed, cross-referenced. The invasion would involve over 150,000 men landing on 5 beaches across a 50-mile front. The planning required precision that bordered on obsession. Henri threw himself into it. The work kept him from thinking too much about Marie and Sophie, still in Switzerland, still waiting. The paperwork for bringing them to England was moving slowly through bureaucratic channels. He wrote to them twice a week, receiving responses that took 10 days to arrive. Sophie was 9 now. He had missed 2 years of her life. He tried not to calculate how many more he might miss before the war ended. In late January, Henri encountered Corbeau again. The major was attending a briefing on coastal defenses, and they found themselves in the same conference room, surrounded by maps and photographs of French beaches Henri had never seen. Corbeau nodded to him across the room. After the briefing, they spoke briefly in the hallway. "How are you finding London?" Corbeau asked. "Busy," Henri replied. "And cold. It gets worse before it gets better." Corbeau paused. "I heard about your family. That they're safe in Switzerland. I'm glad. Thank you. Are you bringing them here?" "Trying to. The paperwork is." Henri gestured vaguely. "Complicated. Everything is complicated now." Corbeau glanced around, then lowered his voice. "There are rumors about the invasion. That it will happen soon. Spring, maybe early summer." Henri nodded. Everyone knew the invasion was coming. The only questions were when and where. The Germans knew it too. They were fortifying the entire Atlantic coast, building the Atlantic Wall, concrete bunkers, beach obstacles, minefields. Waiting for the blow they knew must fall. "When it happens," Corbeau said quietly, "many people will die. Allied soldiers, French civilians, Germans. The liberation will be bloody. I know. But it has to happen. There's no other way to end this." Henri met his eyes. "No. There isn't." They parted with a handshake. Henri returned to his office and spent the rest of the day reviewing intelligence reports from Normandy. Beach obstacles. Tidal patterns. German troop positions. Each detail was a piece of a puzzle that would determine whether thousands of men lived or died when they hit those beaches. The weight of it was crushing sometimes. But it was also clarifying. This was what mattered. Not regulations or protocols, but the decisions that would save lives or cost them. Henri had learned that lesson in Washington. He carried it with him now. February passed in a blur of meetings and reports. The invasion planning consumed everything. Henri worked 12-hour days, sometimes longer, returning to his small flat in Bloomsbury exhausted and unable to sleep. The city was blacked out at night, dark except for the occasional sweep of searchlights looking for bombers that rarely came anymore. The Luftwaffe had been beaten back, but the threat remained. In early March, Henri received word that Marie and Sophie's transfer to England had been approved. They would arrive in April, traveling through France under Red Cross protection, then by ship from Lisbon. It seemed impossible, moving through occupied territory, across borders, over water patrolled by U-boats. But the Red Cross had done it before. They would do it again. Henri allowed himself to hope. The work continued. In mid-March, a new intelligence report crossed Henry's desk that made him stop and read twice. It concerned a German officer stationed in Caen, a major named Klaus Richter who had been observed making contact with French civilians in ways that suggested possible sympathies with the resistance. Henri recognized the name immediately. This was the same officer mentioned in Marcel reports over a year ago, the one Henri had flagged as a potential asset. The one Caldwell had noted and then apparently forgotten. But someone hadn't forgotten. The report indicated that Richter had been providing information to resistance contacts for months. Small things at first, warnings about raids, blind spots in patrol routes. More recently, he had shared details about German defensive positions around Caen, information that was now being incorporated into invasion planning. Henri read the report 3 times, then walked it personally to the intelligence section. He found the officer in charge, a British colonel named Whitmore, and asked about Richter. "Ah yes, the German major," Whitmore said. "Interesting case. We're not entirely sure what motivates him. Conscience, perhaps. Or just exhaustion with the war. Either way, his information has been valuable. Is he being extracted?" Henri asked. "No. Too risky. If he disappeared, the Germans would know he was compromised. Better to leave him in place and use what he provides. And after the invasion? When Caen is liberated?" Whitmore shrugged. "If he survives, we'll debrief him. If not..." He didn't finish the sentence. Henri returned to his office troubled. Klaus Richter was risking his life to provide intelligence that would help Allied forces. But no one was planning to save him. He was useful where he was, so he would stay there, and when the invasion came, he would face the same dangers as every other German soldier in Normandy. It was logical. It was strategic. It was the kind of decision that won wars. But it felt wrong. Henri spent the evening thinking about it. About Richter, a man he'd never met, who had made choices that paralleled his own. About the mathematics of war, where individual lives were weighed against strategic objectives. About the question that had haunted him since Washington: when did duty require you to sacrifice people, and when did conscience demand you try to save them? He didn't have an answer. But he knew he couldn't simply ignore it. April arrived with spring rain and the sense that time was running out. The invasion was close now, everyone could feel it. The buildup of men and material across southern England was impossible to hide. Thousands of ships, millions of tons of supplies, entire armies waiting for the order to move. On April 15th, Marie and Sophie arrived in London. Henri met them at Victoria Station, standing on the platform as the train pulled in, scanning faces until he saw them: his wife, thinner than he remembered, her hair streaked with gray; his daughter, no longer a child but a girl on the edge of adolescence, tall and serious and beautiful. They saw him at the same moment. Sophie ran first, crashing into him with force that nearly knocked him over. Marie followed more slowly, and when Henri wrapped his arms around both of them, he felt something break inside him, all the control he had maintained for 2 years, all the distance he had kept from his own emotions, suddenly collapsing. They stood on the platform holding each other while crowds moved around them, and Henri let himself feel everything he had been holding back. Relief. Joy. Grief for the time lost. Gratitude that they had survived. That night, in the small flat he had found for them in Bloomsbury, Marie told him about Lyon. About the resistance work she had done, passing messages and hiding refugees. About the night the Gestapo came and she fled with Sophie, moving through darkness to a safe house, then another, then another. About the weeks it took to reach Switzerland, traveling with forged papers and the constant fear of discovery. "I wanted to tell you," she said, "in my letters. But I couldn't risk it." "I know," Henri said. "I understand." Sophie sat between them, listening. She was quieter than Henri remembered, more watchful. The war had taken her childhood and replaced it with something harder, more aware. But she was alive. They were together. That was what mattered. Over the following days, Henri tried to balance work and family. He took Sophie to see the Tower of London, the British Museum, Hyde Park. He and Marie walked along the Thames in the evenings, talking about the future, about what they would do when the war ended. They didn't talk about the invasion, though it hung over everything like a storm about to break. On April 28, Henri was summoned to a meeting he hadn't expected. Colonel Whitmore from intelligence wanted to see him, along with Corbeau and 2 other officers Henri didn't recognize. They met in a secure room at Norfolk House. Whitmore got straight to the point. "We have a problem," he said. "Klaus Richter, the German major in Cannes. He's sent word through resistance channels that he wants to defect. He says he has critical information about German defensive plans, but he'll only share it if we guarantee his extraction after the invasion." Henri felt his pulse quicken. "What kind of information?" "He claims to know the location of panzer reserves, the armored divisions the Germans are holding back to counterattack once we land. If he's telling the truth, this could be the most important intelligence we received before D-Day." "And if he's lying?" one of the other officers asked. "If this is a German trap?" "That's the question," Whitmore said. He turned to Corbeau. "Your network has been in contact with Richter. What's your assessment?" Corbeau was quiet for a moment. "I believe he's genuine. The information he's provided over the past months has been accurate. He's taken real risks. But..." He paused. "Extracting him will be difficult. Cannes will be a primary objective during the invasion. It's going to be heavily contested. Getting one man out alive in the middle of that will be nearly impossible. So we tell him no," another officer said. "We use what he's already given us and leave him to his fate." "That's one option," Whitmore agreed. He looked at Henri. "Captain Moreau, you flagged Richter as a potential asset over a year ago. You've been following his case. What do you think?" Henri felt everyone's eyes on him. This was Washington again. Marcel again. The same impossible choice dressed in different circumstances. "If Richter has information about panzer positions," Henri said carefully, "that could save thousands of Allied lives. We need that information." "Agreed. But do we need to extract him to get it?" Henri thought about the photograph Corbeau had given him. 17 faces. 17 people who had survived because someone gave them a chance. "If we want him to trust us," Henri said, "if we want him to give us everything he knows, we have to offer him something real. Not a vague promise, but a concrete plan. Show him we're serious about getting him out." "Even if the plan might fail?" Whitmore asked. "Even then. Give him a chance. That's all anyone can ask for." The room was quiet. Corbeau was watching Henri with an expression that might have been recognition or approval. Finally, Whitmore nodded. "All right. We'll develop an extraction plan. Captain Moreau, you'll coordinate with Major Corbeau on the details. This needs to be ready before the invasion." The meeting ended. As they left the room, Corbeau pulled Henri aside. "You're doing it again," he said quietly. "Doing what?" "Choosing to save someone when it would be easier not to. When the strategic calculus says it's not worth the risk." Henri met his eyes. "Is that wrong?" "No," Corbeau said. "It's the only thing that keeps us human." The extraction plan took shape over the following weeks. It was complex, fragile, dependent on timing and luck and a dozen factors no one could control. Richter would remain in Caen until the invasion began. Once Allied forces landed, he would move to a designated location in the city, a church near the Orne River. A team from the resistance would meet him there and move him through German lines to Allied positions. It was dangerous for everyone involved. The resistance team would be operating in a combat zone. Richter would be deserting his post, risking execution if caught. Allied forces would have to be notified not to shoot a German officer trying to cross lines. Any one of 100 things could go wrong. But it was a chance. That was all Henri could offer. In early May, Richter sent confirmation through resistance channels. He accepted the plan. In exchange, he provided detailed intelligence on German panzer positions, 2 armored divisions held in reserve near Caen, ready to counterattack any Allied landing. The information was exactly what Allied planners needed. Invasion strategy was adjusted based on what Richter revealed. Henri worked on the extraction details with Corbeau and a resistance coordinator named Simone, a woman in her 30s who had been operating in Normandy since 1941. She was calm, precise, unsentimentally about risk. "The team going in won't all come out," she said during one planning session. "You understand that, yes? We're asking people to move through a battlefield to save one German officer. Some of them will die." "I know," Henri said. "And you still think it's worth it?" Henri thought about that. About the mathematics of war, where you weighed lives against strategic objectives. About Klaus Richter, who had spent months risking everything to help the Allies. About the resistance fighters who would volunteer for this mission knowing the odds. "Yes," he said finally. "I think it's worth it." Simone studied him for a moment, then nodded. "All right. We'll do it." The invasion date was set for early June, dependent on weather and tides. The exact day remained classified, known only to the highest levels of command. But everyone could feel it approaching. The tension in London was palpable, a city waiting for the moment that would determine everything. Henri spent his evenings with Marie and Sophie, trying to give them normalcy in a world that had forgotten what normal meant. They cooked simple meals together, read books, listened to the BBC. Sophie asked him once what he did at work, and he told her he helped plan things, which was true enough. He didn't tell her about Richter, about the extraction plan, about the choices that kept him awake at night. On May 28, Henri received word that the resistance team for Richter's extraction had been finalized. 5 people, all volunteers, all aware of the risks. Simone would lead them. They would move into position in Caen 2 days before the invasion, waiting for the moment when chaos would provide cover. Henri reviewed their dossiers. Young and old, men and women, all with code names instead of real identities. Renard. Colombi. Lion. Etoile. Amber. 5 people who would risk everything for a German officer they'd never met, because someone had asked them to, because it was the right thing to do. He thought about writing to them, saying something that would acknowledge what they were about to do. But what could he say? Thank you seemed inadequate. Good luck felt hollow. In the end, he wrote nothing. Some debts couldn't be expressed in words. On June 1st, Henri was called to a final briefing. The invasion was set for June 5th, weather permitting. Richter had been notified. The resistance team was in position. Everything was ready. Once this begins, Whitmore said, we won't have control over what happens. Richter either makes it to the extraction point or he doesn't. The team either gets him out or they don't. All we can do is give them the best chance possible. Henri nodded. He had learned that lesson already. You made the plan, you took the risk, and then you waited to see if it worked. Control was an illusion. All you could do was try. June 5th was postponed due to weather. The invasion was rescheduled for June 6th. Henri spent that day with Marie and Sophie, walking through Regent's Park in grey drizzle, not talking about what was coming. That night, he lay awake listening to the sound of aircraft overhead, thousands of planes carrying paratroopers toward Normandy, the first wave of an invasion that would involve over 1 million men before it was finished. The war was reaching its climax. And somewhere in Cannes, Klaus Richter was waiting to see if the promise Omri had made would be kept. The news from Normandy came in fragments. The landings were successful, but costly. Thousands dead on the beaches. Thousands more wounded. Allied forces were pushing inland, but German resistance was fierce. Cannes, which planners had hoped to capture on D-Day, remained in German hands. The battle for the city would be brutal. Omri waited for word about Richter. Days passed with no information. The resistance team had gone silent, not unusual in combat conditions, but agonizing for those waiting. Omri continued his work, processing reports from Normandy, but part of his mind was always in Cannes, wondering if the extraction had worked, if Richter was alive, if the 5 resistance fighters had survived. On June 12, 6 days after the invasion, a message arrived through resistance channels. It was brief, coded, almost cryptic. Package delivered. 3 home. 2 stayed. Omri read it 3 times before he understood. Richter had been extracted. 3 members of the resistance team had made it back to Allied lines. 2 had been killed in the operation. He sat at his desk for a long time, staring at the message. Success and failure, intertwined. 6 people alive because of a plan he had helped create. 2 people dead for the same reason. Was it worth it? He didn't know. He would never know. Later that day, Omri received a more detailed report. Klaus Richter was in Allied custody, being debriefed. The intelligence he provided was proving invaluable, details about German defensive plans, command structure, supply lines. The information would save lives, shorten the battle for Normandy, bring the war closer to its end. The 2 resistance fighters who died were identified only by their code names, Colombe and Lion. A woman and a man. Omri would never know their real names, never know who they had been before the war, never know who warned them. They had volunteered for a dangerous mission and paid the ultimate price. Omri thought about them often in the days that followed. About the choice they had made, knowing the risks. About whether they would have considered their deaths worthwhile. About the mathematics of war, where you traded lives for objectives and hoped the equation balanced. On June 20th, Omri was granted permission to meet Klaus Richter. The German major was being held at a secure facility outside London, awaiting transfer to a more permanent location. Omri traveled there on a gray afternoon, not entirely sure what he wanted to say. Richter was younger than Omri expected, mid-30s, with tired eyes and the bearing of someone who had carried weight for too long. They met in a small room with a British intelligence officer present. Captain Moreau, Richter said in accented English. I was told you helped plan my extraction. I was part of the team, Omri said. Then I owe you my life. Richter paused. I heard that 2 of the resistance fighters died getting me out. Is that true? Yes. Richter looked down at his hands. I think about that. About whether I was worth 2 lives. They volunteered, Omri said. They knew the risks. Does that make it better? Omri thought about Marcel. About the 9 who had walked across France in the Pyrenees. About the 17 faces in the photograph Corbeau had given him. About all the impossible choices this war had forced on people who just wanted to survive. No, he said honestly. It doesn't make it better. But it makes it their choice. They decided what they were willing to risk. We have to honor that. Richter met his eyes. Why did you do it? Why risk so much for a German officer? Omri considered the question. Because you were trying to do the right thing. Because you deserved a chance. Because. He paused. Because if we stop caring about individual lives, we've already lost what we're fighting for. They talked for another hour. Richter described his journey from loyal German officer to someone who could no longer support what his country had become. The turning point had been a massacre he witnessed in Russia, civilians executed for no reason beyond collective punishment. After that, he couldn't unsee what his army was doing. He started looking for ways to resist, small acts at first, then larger ones. I don't expect forgiveness, Richter said. I wore the uniform. I followed orders for years before I questioned them. But I wanted to do something. To balance the scales, even slightly. Henri understood. He had spent 2 years in Washington feeling useless, processing papers while others fought. The Marcel operation had given him a chance to matter, to make choices that affected real lives. Richter had felt the same need, to act, to resist, to prove to himself that he was more than a cog in a machine. When Henri left the facility, he felt something close to peace. Not happiness, too many people had died for that. But a sense that he had done what he could, that he had made choices he could live with. The war continued. Caen fell to Allied forces in July after weeks of brutal fighting. Paris was liberated in August. By autumn, Allied forces were pushing into Germany itself. The end was visible now, though still distant. Henri continued his work at SHAEF, coordinating intelligence, attending meetings, processing the endless flow of information that kept the war machine running. Marie and Sophie adapted to life in London. They talked about returning to France someday, when it was safe, when the cities were rebuilt and the wounds had begun to heal. In September, Henri received a letter from Corbeau. The major was still in France, working with resistance forces as they transitioned into regular army units. He wrote about the liberation, about seeing French cities freed from occupation, about the joy and the devastation intertwined. At the end of the letter, Corbeau wrote, "I heard about the German major you extracted from Caen. About the 2 resistance fighters who died in the operation. I know you will carry that weight. But I want you to understand something. Those 2 people made a choice. They chose to risk their lives for someone they believed deserved saving. That is not tragedy, that is heroism. And you gave them the opportunity to be heroes. Never forget that." Henri read the letter several times. He wasn't sure he agreed entirely. Heroism felt like too grand a word for decisions made in desperation and uncertainty. But perhaps Corbeau was right. Perhaps the only way to survive this war with your humanity intact was to believe that individual choices mattered, that trying to save lives was worth the risk, even when you failed. In October, Henri learned that Klaus Richter had been transferred to a prisoner of war camp for German officers who had cooperated with the Allies. He would remain there until the war ended, then face an uncertain future in a Germany that would not forgive his defection. But he was alive. The intelligence he provided had contributed to Allied success in Normandy. His choice to resist had mattered. Henri thought about all of them sometimes, the 17 from Marcel, the 5 resistance fighters who went into Caen, Klaus Richter, Corbeau, all the people whose lives had intersected with his because of choices made in quiet offices and dangerous streets. Some had survived. Some hadn't. But all of them had tried. All of them had chosen to act rather than simply endure. That was what Henri would remember when the war finally ended. Not the strategic victories or the grand campaigns, but the individual moments when people chose conscience over convenience, when they risked everything for strangers, when they proved that humanity could survive even in the machinery of war. The war in Europe ended in May 1945. Henri was in London when the news came, standing in Trafalgar Square among thousands of people celebrating victory. Marie and Sophie were beside him, and for the first time in 6 years, Henri allowed himself to believe that the future might hold something other than waiting and loss. They returned to France in June, to a lion that had been scarred but not broken. Their apartment was still standing, though someone else lived there now. They found a new place, smaller, and began the work of rebuilding a life. In August, Henri received a letter from Corbeau. His real name was Jean-Paul Mercier, and he was teaching again at a lycée in Rennes. He invited Henri to visit, to meet the 17 people from Marcel who had survived the war. Henri went in September, traveling by train through a countryside still marked by war but beginning to heal. Mercier met him at the station, and they drove to a small farm outside the city where the reunion was being held. 17 people. Henri recognized them from the photograph, though they looked different now, older, marked by what they had endured, but alive. They gathered around him, shaking his hand, thanking him in words that felt inadequate to the moment. One woman, elderly and frail, took both his hands in hers. "You gave us a chance," she said simply. "That is everything." They spent the afternoon together, sharing food and wine and stories. They talked about the war, about what they had lost and what they had saved. They didn't speak of Henri as a hero, he had made that clear he didn't want that. But they acknowledged what he had done, the risk he had taken, the choice that had given them all a future. As the sun set over the French countryside, Mercier pulled Henri aside. "I heard about the German officer," he said. "Richter. That you helped extract him from Caen." "Yes. And that 2 resistance fighters died in the operation." Henri nodded. "Colombe and Lion. I never learned their real names." "I did," Mercier said quietly. Colombe was Marie Dubois, a teacher from Caen. 26 years old. Lion was André Laurent, a mechanic. 34, with 2 children. "I wanted you to know who they were." Henri felt something tighten in his chest. Names. Real people, not just code names in a report. "They volunteered," Mercier continued. "They knew the risks. And they believed it was worth it, to save someone who had tried to do the right thing, even if he was the enemy." "I think about them," Henri said. "About whether it was worth their lives." "That's not your question to answer," Mercier said gently. "They answered it themselves when they volunteered. Your job was to give them the choice. You did that. The rest was theirs." They stood in silence for a moment, watching the sun sink below the horizon. "The war is over," Mercier said finally. "We survived. Not all of us, but enough. And we survived because people like you made choices that mattered. Remember that." Henri returned to Lion the next day, carrying the weight of names and faces and choices that would stay with him for the rest of his life. He didn't know if he had done the right thing, in Washington, in London, in all the moments when he had chosen to act rather than obey. But he knew he had tried. He had given people chances. Some had survived. Some hadn't. But all of them had been given the dignity of choice. That would have to be enough. Years later, when Sophie asked him what he had done in the war, Henri told her the truth. About Marcel and the 17 people who survived. About Klaus Richter and the 2 resistance fighters who died saving him. About all the impossible choices and the weight they carried. "Were you a hero, Papa?" Sophie asked. Henri thought about that. About heroism and duty and the space between them where real people made real choices. "No," he said finally. "I was just someone who tried to do the right thing, even when I wasn't sure what that was. That's all any of us can do." Sophie nodded, understanding in a way only someone who had lived through war could understand. Henri Moreau lived until 1982. He never spoke publicly about his role in the Marcel operation or the extraction of Klaus Richter. But he kept the photograph of 17 faces on his desk until the day he died, a reminder of the moment when he learned that individual lives mattered more than any regulation, any protocol, any strategic calculation. In the end, that was his legacy. Not grand victories or strategic brilliance, but the simple, stubborn insistence that every life deserved a chance. That conscience mattered more than convenience. That humanity could survive even in the machinery of war. 17 people lived because of choices he made. 2 died. Klaus Richter survived and lived quietly in Argentina until his death in 1973, never returning to Germany. The mathematics never balanced. But Henri had learned to live with that. Because some equations couldn't be solved, only endured. And the only way to endure them was to keep choosing, keep trying, keep believing that individual moments of conscience could matter in a world consumed by conflict. That was enough. That was everything.